From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
This is Emilye Crosby with Jennifer Lawson in her home in Washington, D.C. on December 11th, 2015. We're here with the Civil Rights History Project, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you for doing the interview with us.
Thank you for asking me to do this. It's an honor.
We're honored as well. Can you start by telling us when and where you were born and about your family?
Yes, I was born in Fairfield, Alabama. Fairfield is a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. One street is Fairfield, the next street is Birmingham. And it's on the western side of the city. And I was born there in 1946, in June of 1946. My father came from central Alabama. He was the 14th of 15 children, and that he then was born in 1899, and he left he was born in what is now Bullock County, Alabama, near Union Springs. And he left that area when he was 15 years old and left working on the farm there and moved to Birmingham, just really essentially ran away to find a job and find work in Birmingham.
Did he want to get away from the farm, or was he just...
He wanted to get away from the farm, he had a third grade education. He was an incredibly curious man, really smart guy, and that he wanted more, he wanted to be able to learn more. And he came to Birmingham, he went to Birmingham, and that in Birmingham, he got a job first in the coal mines there. And after working in the coal mines, he then ended up driving the locomotive through the coal mines, and that he started saving his money, and he bought a tractor. And he took it apart, put it back together again so that he wouldn't then know how to repair tractors. He did the same with a car, and then he started a little business that he called Lawson's Repair, and that he then would essentially take everything apart, put it back together again. And so his business, he repaired washing machines, refrigerators, and his the people that he served lived throughout the Birmingham area. And through him, I ended up getting to travel to some of the places that were mining camps and company towns, and to hear union leaders, and when people were on strike in some of the company towns. It was quite fast. There were these communities, Powderly, in Bessemer, Brighton, and these were these other places, little towns that were company towns for Tennessee Coal and Iron, which later became a subsidiary of U.S. Steel.
So he would take you with him when he was picking up or delivering?
Right,
or
exactly.
Would he ever go around and repair stuff where it was?
He did, indeed. He often would. If a car had a breakdown, that it's quite possible that he would then repair that car on site. You know, rather than towing it or anything, he would repair it on site. And that he taught me and my brothers when we were relatively young. He taught us how to do some basic repairs, and so that I felt very comfortable with technology. It was something where when I was really small, he insisted that I learn to rewire a motor and to create a motor. So I really began to understand the principles of how a motor worked, but it was boring to me to have to wind all of these coils of copper wire to actually create a motor from scratch.
That's amazing.
But I learned those kinds of things, and then he would allow us to keep the money if we then did small repairs, so that in the wintertime, when someone's battery didn't start or something, and they needed a battery charge, those were things that we learned to do.
So it enhances his business,
Right.
gives you spending money.
Exactly.
I'm just sort of amazed at that ability, that he could just learn how to do all of those things just by taking them apart. That's kind of remarkable.
No, it was quite remarkable, and that there's an article that we have been searching for, my brothers and I have been searching for. We had heard about it when we were children, but we've never found it. It was, other people, though so many people around us talked about it, that we felt that it must exist somewhere. And that was that during, around World War I, before I was born, World War II, sorry, before I was born, that because there was gas rationing, that it was very difficult. He liked to travel too. He really enjoyed seeing the world as much as he could and traveling, which meant that he would drive places. He would drive from Birmingham to Toronto or from Birmingham to Los Angeles. And he then, on one of these trips around 1945, he drove apparently from Birmingham to Canada. And that the article that some people say was in Life magazine, but I've never found it, was the headline for it apparently was that this Birmingham man goes to Canada on 1 gallon of gas. And the reason that he was able to do the 1 gallon of gas is because he only needed the gasoline to start the car, to ignite the fuel, but then the rest of the journey, he'd really be burning these low-grade fuels like kerosene, and that he had done some special converter to allow him in the car, with the car engine, that allowed him to do this.
Wow.
So he was, an inventor in his own way too, and he was a tinkerer. So we owned our own home, and we lived in Fairfield, and that immediately behind there was a little small backyard, but the majority of our backyard was taken up with his business. And that in his business, his repair shop, and there would at any given moment be, 2 or 3 cars there for repair, and he had a couple of men who worked with him to help him. And then he'd also have refrigerators or small appliances that he was working on, 2 fans.
It's kind of amazing that he stayed in Birmingham, I think, or in that area with that kind of curiosity. Do you have a sense of why and an interest in travel, and was he connected to family or the community in a way?
I don't think that was necessarily what kept him there, but I think that it's not as though we had the financial wherewithal to pick up and move somewhere. I think that it was quite an achievement, I think, to live as comfortably as we were living, where we did own our own home. But we were living in a community where the economic range went from the doctor and the pharmacist, who were, a couple of blocks over, who had sort of much more magnificent homes. We had just a little modest, bungalow-style house. And that then there were the kids who lived in the alley, and their houses were actually in the alley. And so in some of those, when I was growing up, they didn't even yet have plumbing, indoor plumbing.
So a real remarkable
So you had that kind of economic mixture, and that with my father's business, there were any number of times where when the mines were on a strike or when there were layoffs, that instead of collecting cash for work that he would do, that he would come home with all kinds of things. It's like, here's a lady's watch or a radio or something, but it was real barter business, whatever he could get for it. Right, exactly.
I guess if your customer base doesn't have money.
Right.
Did you ever think it was strange that he had you learning all of this along with your brothers, that he didn't differentiate?
At first I did, but then it was something where I enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. I thought I liked it. I liked the fact that he didn't differentiate. I liked the fact that he respected us as thinkers, not just as his children. There were times when he definitely treated us as his children, and that we were subject to the same kind of corporal punishment as all the kids in the neighborhood, which was just awful. But there were other times when I feel that he respected us as thinkers. He would buy books. He'd buy, what his version of the encyclopedia, and it was for him, a good evening at home was that after he had worked, that he would sit and read just at random, from the encyclopedia, and it was something that was a kind of curiosity that inspired me as well, and but for traveling, he'd talk about other places in the world, but as I said, that he'd talk about places that he wanted to go to, but that it was quite something for us in our community, for us, the other people would marvel at the fact that we then would go to Mexico or go to Canada.
That's just sort of, in general, out of reach in your community?
Right, exactly.
What did you like about the travel?
Oh, just the fact of seeing the rest of the world. One part of it was that here we were in Birmingham, and that in Fairfield, we had our own little protected community in some ways. And of course, none of these places are actually truly protected. But we had a little parallel universe so it was totally segregated during the time that I was growing up. Absolutely segregated. And so that there were signs in downtown Fairfield that said, laundromat, white only, gas station, white only, restaurants, all the businesses. And the bus stopped in front of my house that then went to downtown Birmingham. It was just, you could get on the bus and for, really cheap, go to downtown Birmingham. But it was that kind of segregated bus that had the movable barriers that were white on one side, colored on the other, and you were supposed to sit behind it. And we kids would play with that by then getting on the bus. And usually in our neighborhood, when we get on, it would be pretty empty. So we'd get on and move the barrier up towards the front.
So whites didn't have any space?
So whites didn't have any space to sit by the time it, moved around to their neighborhood on its journey.
Would you get in trouble?
Of course.
But not serious trouble?
But not serious trouble, yeah. We were never threatened or anything. The driver would, sort of make us, yell at us and tell us to move back.
Well, I've seen the images and heard people talk about, like in Montgomery, in some of the testimony of the cases that came out related to the bus boycott, that the front of the bus reserved for whites would be empty. And because whites didn't even ride the bus in as high numbers, and so moving it seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
But it's so we had this somewhat protected world, and that it was we had our own doctors, pharmacists, dentists, and so my father was a part of that world, and that he was the repair person, and that there was people were organized by churches in part, but we were a little bit different in that respect too, that while my father belonged to the largest Baptist church there, that he was active there, he didn't require us to go. He required that we should go to a church on Sundays, but that it didn't have to be his church.
That's very interesting.
So he encouraged this kind of free thinking. Now, I haven't mentioned my mother. My mother had been, before they married, she had been a school teacher, and that she had attended college, and so she taught school. But after my brother, I have a brother who's 2 years older, and that after he was born, she stopped working and was a housewife. And so she would, from time to time, though, work as a substitute teacher at the schools, but for the most part, she didn't work, and that she spent a lot of her time reading.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. So she read novels, she read, mostly, I don't remember any real nonfiction books, but I do remember novels and magazines.
Do you have a sense of whether she missed that work, being able to work? Do you know?
I think she did. I think she, for me, she is a rather tragic figure, because I think that she was lonely in some ways and missed the world that she would have had she been working.
And was that something, I mean, obviously, I don't know if you know this within their relationship, but did your father want her to be home, or did she feel like she should be?
But I think that it was a sign of, for those times, I think that that was a sign of well-being. I think that for the men of that world, that it was a sign that they were a good provider, and it was a sign of how well they were doing, that their wives didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there were other women in the neighborhood who, to make ends meet, they had little home businesses where they were the Avon lady, or that they were the hairstylist, but working out of their kitchen as a hairstylist, not out of a real shop or a salon, or a seamstress. So there were all kinds, but my mother didn't work at all. She didn't work. But I don't think it was something that really suited her that well. And I think that she was really depressed because of that. You don't think of it as being depressed when you're a child, but when you look back and you recognize that, oh, this is what's wrong with that picture.
You started to talk about what the travel meant to you, and then I think we got diverted.
Yes. So the travel for me, and I got diverted because I wanted you to understand that it really was this truly segregated world, and that it was a world where you couldn't go to a decent library. And I'll come back to that, please, I'd like to come back to the library part, but that instead, so it was so constricted, and when we would travel, we would go to places like we'd come here to Washington, D.C., or we would go to New York. And my father then was always the leader of these excursions, and that we went, when we were children, we went to the Museum of Natural History, the Hayden Planetarium, and those places in New York so much that I had grown to hate them. It was like, oh no, not again. I don't want to see the mummies. I don't want to see
Too educational.
But you appreciated it very much. But it was, and he would have this, he sort of was our tour guide.
Today is the Coney Island Day.
And he had this narration. There were some things that, like, I keep trying to remember where it was. There was some place where they had an exhibit that was these stones from someplace like Peru or but he wanted us to understand that the people had built those without any mortar, and that they had cut the stones so precisely that you couldn't slip a sheet of paper between them. So it was that kind of...
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, it was that kind of narration that went with it.
You can't just go look at the dinosaurs.
No. So he had all of these details of things that really were interesting to him, and that he expected that they should be of equal interest to us. Yeah. And that one day at the Smithsonian, certainly, at the Museum of Natural, one day was not enough. You needed multiple days to go through.
Sounds like he should have been a teacher.
So he was in his own way, very much so. Very much so. And we used to joke and say that, boy, if he had a real education, he would have been really dangerous.
That sounds like it.
Because, but it was, so the travel for me was this exposure to this much, much broader world. It was a place where going to New York, you didn't feel that, oh, whites must live here, blacks must live here. We visited relatives who lived in integrated neighborhoods.
So it really makes that seem like an arbitrary...
Right, exactly. You went to, you got on the New York subway, you got on a bus in New York City, and it's just people on a bus. You went to a pizza place or you went to a restaurant or something. And in Birmingham, the only restaurants you could go to were the, sort of little soul food, black-owned places. And for the larger white restaurants, then you couldn't go there to eat. And that if you wanted their food, then they had the little window in the back.
Would you do that? Would anybody in your family do that?
There were times where if a new restaurant that was supposed to have something very tasty or something, there were times when people would then go and try the food. And in Birmingham, you couldn't use the library to avoid integrating things. That there was one point where they even took the seats out. So it was, you could, but we were relegated to these segregated libraries that had, sort of worn books and these tattered books. And so it was, and in Fairfield, the women in my community had started their own library. And so I and some of the other kids, we volunteer and help with the library. But it was there was a pharmacist, our pharmacist, Dr. Parham, Parham. He owned a building, and that Parham's Apothecary, and that his building was sort of the center of our little black world. And that was the place where I had my first job, where I got paid really, separate from my working for my father, and that was working in Dr. Parham's store. And I worked at the counter, and he had ice cream, and I, sold ice cream to my kids, my friends, but his wife, Mrs. Parham, then took one of the rooms above the drugstore and made it a library, made it a community library, and that she and several other women of the community then maintained that library.
Was it a popular place?
It was for us. I don't know how many people used it, but for my generation, it was an important place. Yeah.
So you've talked about this a little bit already, but can you talk about sort of how you encountered race and understood it when you were young?
I think the first time I became really conscious of race was when I was very young, probably about 5 or so, 4 or 5, and that it was directly across from my house. My house was at the corner of a rather busy intersection. And this is when I say busy, we're talking in relative terms here.
We're not talking D.C.?
No, we're talking relative terms. It's that people actually did walk past because there was, they used the sidewalks and walked past because there was a mailbox on the corner. The bus stop was on that same corner, and across the street from my house, there was a store. The store, from the time that I can remember as a child, the store was owned by the Ragusa family, and they were Italian Americans, and that the grandparents lived there and were the ones who had first, when I was really small, they had started the store. But then there was this younger family, I assume their children, the son and his wife and children worked in the store, and they lived adjacent to the store. So this was a white Italian-American family living in the store, and this was not uncommon. You had then in these, probably for every 6 blocks, you had then one of these little Italian-American grocers.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that I played with this girl, Teresa Ragusa, who lived across the street. And that she and I were like best friends, because we'd get up in the morning and you go out and play. And so since she was right across the street, we played together, and the other kids, she played with the other African American kids. And there came that point when it was time for us to go to elementary school. And that's when her relatives and my black friends said, you can't play together anymore.
Really?
And we sort of didn't get it. We didn't understand.
And you're getting it from both sides.
Right, exactly. That you can't play together anymore. Yeah.
Would you try to sneak and play?
Well, she would be on the other side. We'd stand there talking to each other from our respective sides of the street.
It's
Yeah.
so sad.
Oh, it really was. And I'd be sort of saying, look, I got a new doll, and then she would sort of say, oh, could you come over? And I said, no, I can't. And she would say, oh, and I can't come over. So it was this sort of separation like that.
Yeah.
So that was my first sort of consciousness of that, okay, it's a world where we are separated by race. And then I'd hear the adults, you'd hear about, there would be the times where you'd hear the adults talking about something really awful that had happened, a lynching or things that they were talking about.
Would they try to protect you from that, or would they try to teach you about it?
They really didn't talk to us directly about it, but you'd hear, they wouldn't stop talking just because you were in the room or around.
So they didn't try to keep it from you, but they weren't really engaged.
Right, exactly,
with it. Yeah.
exactly.
Do you remember any of the things that you heard them talk about?
The worst thing that, and I don't, I was older when this happened. I don't remember what year it occurred, but it was well documented. It was a news article. There were several news articles about it. Was of an African American man who was kidnapped and castrated, and in Birmingham, and that the white men who kidnapped him to sort of harm him even more, they poured kerosene on the wound, and unbeknownst to them, that actually saved his life. That caused the blood to clot, and so that he did not bleed to death, but instead that actually saved his life. But that became something that people talked about.
It's awful.
Yeah. So that was, you knew that was a part of this world as well.
And did you connect that to yourself, like that something like that could happen to you or your community?
Oh, you very definitely did. I mean, it was that you knew that this was a world where you knew I knew of the Ku Klux Klan, and I knew that the Klan had marched somewhere. I didn't know how close or how far it was from me, but I knew of the Ku Klux Klan. I knew what they looked like, what an image of them looked like. I knew that there were all of these awful and threatening things that whites did to black people.
Were you aware of the bombs in Birmingham? Was it Bombing Hill?
It was, of course. And by the time that was really more intense, then I was getting towards high school, or already in high school, and we would go back and forth. Birmingham, as I said, I mean, we lived just, Fairfield is a suburb, but it's truly just right there adjacent to Birmingham. And about maybe 6 blocks from my house, there was a small, historically black college, Miles College. And the college was financially not doing terribly well, but it was a place where there were then college professors and others who were there at Miles, but because of the state of disrepair, we considered it a big playground, sort of.
They're trying to save the college, and for you it's a playground?
Right. Because we could ride our bikes around, and there was no traffic on the campus and things. But it was, that too became a place of community in a sense. One of the one year, for example, and my mother and some of the other people in the neighborhood, I don't remember my father participating in this, but some of the other people in the neighborhood, we went to Miles College to a screening of the film Imitation of Life.
Oh, yeah.
That it had been banned, I think, or they couldn't play it at the Segregated Black Theater downtown, the Carver Theater, named after George Washington Carver, of course. So we couldn't go to the Carver Theater to see this film, but the Miles College was doing a screening of it.
Yeah.
And so we went to this screening of Imitation of Life. And this was one of the earlier versions of it. There have been several versions of that, but this was one of the earlier versions of it. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a great melodrama of the woman who's passing for white.
So what did you think of that when you were young?
Oh, it became, to me, that was I feel, one of the few times that we as younger people were having a discussion about race with our parents and with the multi-generational.
So the screening included a discussion?
The screening didn't include a discussion, but we just, at home and ours was a society of front porches.
Yeah, and so there was lots of discussion.
Lots of discussion.
Yeah. What do people think about the idea of passing?
Oh, there were people you had people in your family. Everybody sort of knew someone or who was passing and who had disappeared. There were families of, we had some friends who within their families, they were people who, they were very, very light-skinned, and it was almost as though they were prohibited by their families from marrying anybody darker.
Preserve that light.
Preserve the lightness or go towards even more lightness if possible. And it would then, you'd hear that one person from the family was passing now.
Yeah.
And so they were.
We talked to Vernon Damer's family, and they said that quite a few family members had left and crossed over.
Exactly, yeah.
Birmingham, how were you aware of that, or what kind of impact did that have?
Well, we would move back and forth readily. I took music lessons in Birmingham. I studied violin, and that I'd go on Saturdays for my music lessons. At another point, I studied piano, and there was a black business street in downtown Birmingham, and that we would go over to these activities, and that I also had a relative who taught at a high school, the most prominent high school in Birmingham, Parker High, and that through her, then she knew, like, for example, Angela Davis's family, or this attorney, Arthur Shores, and that these were people who lived on this, the street of the sort of wealthier black families, Center Street, and that they had lovely suburban-style, ranch-style houses arrayed along that street. And the attorney, Arthur Shores, was one whose house was regularly bombed. And that later with urban renewal, that they then also built, when they started talking about the freeway, they destroyed that community specifically.
And it was one that whites were angry about because African Americans are encroaching or building nice homes?
It wasn't encroaching. This was a community that had been traditionally black, but it was just the fact that these were people who had nice homes. And so if you can destroy any place, let's do that one.
So getting out of their place with homes so nice?
Yeah. It was.
What were your schools like?
The schools were, I went to Robinson Elementary School, and the school was, these were all segregated schools again in Fairfield, and that they were very poor in terms of classroom resources, equipment. The teachers were not, you had a mixture. You had some teachers who had very little training, had gone to Alabama State or studied education. And then you also had people who were absolutely brilliant, and people who would have, in today's world, probably gone on to Yale or Harvard or someplace and, taught at a major university or at an Ivy League school. But they were then relegated in that segregated world to these limited choices. And so each of these schools would generally have someone like that.
So you were exposed to both very, very, very good and poor.
Right.
education all at the same
Exactly.
time.
Exactly. And that there were people, you felt though that people cared. For example, at my elementary school, at both the elementary school and the high school, that the people who were the school lunchroom ladies,
Yep.
that they cared about the quality of their food because they lived right there in the neighborhood. So they didn't want you going home and saying that what they had prepared was inedible.
Right.
Instead, likely go home and say, "Oh my goodness, she made the best peach cobbler." And they were using food that was the food that was allocated to the school, and in some cases it was the government subsidy. So as one guy sort of says, they could do remarkable things with those cans of government cheese.
Yeah, it's not a lot of variety, it's not a lot of fresh stuff.
Right, right. But they were, did quite remarkable things. But the quality, there were people who they cared, and so, and they cared about us as kids too, quite often.
So they had a real connection, and there was a sense of community with the school.
Right, right. And so there were some kids whose families, one kid whose mother was an alcoholic, and people, it was not just the teachers, but other people in the community would quite often try to reach out to families like that to be really supportive and helpful too.
Yeah.
So that was, you felt this sort of sense of community and of caring. The high school hand-me-down band uniforms, hand-me-down musical instruments, the books, we got the books after Fairfield High School had used them. Fairfield High School was the white school, and then ours was Fairfield Industrial High School. And that this gave me a sense of connection to all the way back to that world of Booker T. Washington, because this was the argument that, they need to have this industrial training and that everybody shouldn't go to college, but so you had a mixture of the vocational education as well as the college prep. It wasn't called college prep, but you had that mixture in the school.
So that influence was still present, it wasn't just the name.
Right, right.
Yeah.
No, it was Fairfield Industrial High School. And in the school, we were one of the saving graces of my life, and for many of us who lived there, was that we had this remarkable man, Edmund J. Oliver, E.J. Oliver, who then was the principal of the high school. And that one of the alums has written a book about him.
Yeah.
Yes. And that he was tough, he was really tough, but that he really sort of ran the school almost as if it was a private school, even though he was dealing with, this mixture of kids the majority of whom were kids of miners and people who worked in the coal mines and the steel mills and who lived in alleys with, substandard housing with no plumbing. And that's the majority of the student body. And that you had occasionally you had this family that was a little wealthier and could go to, London or Paris or something. And then you had the ones like my family. So he had this real range and mixture, but that he put an emphasis on trying to make ladies and gentlemen out of all of us. And and his rules and all of his homilies of, dare to struggle, dare to win. And he was, we, of course, resented that kind of authority, but on the other hand, we respected it. And that later, that after we had graduated from school, that people appreciated him so much that we even had alumni chapters in different cities all around the country, even though the school no longer exists.
That's interesting.
And that we still have every other year on the even-numbered years on the 4th of July weekend, we have a reunion.
Yeah, yeah. That seems like one of the valuable things of some schools in that era where everybody was expected to do well.
Right, right.
Regardless of background.
Yeah.
You described to me another time when we were talking about a family trip and you were going through Mississippi and your family was stopped.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yes, very definitely. And this was on one of the trips west. You know, we would, as I mentioned, we would sometimes go to Los Angeles, Pasadena. And when we do that, we'd even loop down through Mexico and come back. And so one time we were in Mississippi and it was nighttime and we were stopped by the police. And they came over and the policeman shone his flashlight in my, into the car and my father and said, "So boy, where are you going?" Yeah. And my father said, "Oh," he says, "I just got these little cotton pickers in the back here pointing at us." And he says, "And I'm just looking for some work." Yeah. Just looking for some work for them.
Your father was quick on his feet.
And of course, we were resentful like crazy that he's calling us little cotton pickers and everything. But of course, then that completely disarmed, though, the policeman, and that his thing was, "Oh, well, I think that if you go over there, I think they might be hiring somebody over."
That must have been a really mixed feeling
Yeah,
because, of
yeah.
course, if he doesn't do that,
Exactly.
what will happen. And yet, on the other hand,
Exactly.
he has to be subservient.
Right, right. And that it bothered us to see him. I mean, we, of course, thought the world of our father, and it bothered us to see him be subservient to people because he had a lot of white customers, too. And they would bring their cars and everything. And so that was the, "Boy, how soon you think you'll have this one fixed? You think my car will be ready by Thursday, boy?" Yeah. So it was,
Yeah.
yeah.
Did you ever see him challenge that kind of treatment?
No. We never saw him challenge that. Never. No. And that he usually, and we never saw him either challenge it, but we also never saw him sort of being obsequious in any way. It was that his answers were straightforward, but it wasn't as though he was being, hat in hand obsequious either.
Yeah.
And that he was active with the Masons and with other civic groups. They had a burial society, and so he was active with these groups of men, and they would read papers like we had a local Birmingham, the Birmingham Mirror, I think it was called. We had a little local black newspaper, and the Pittsburgh Courier was another paper, and the Chicago Defender. We would get all of those black papers, and so they would talk about things that were happening. And he took great pride in the fact that he had at one point been a business partner with this guy, A.G. Gaston, Arthur Gaston. And Gaston became one of the first black millionaires. And Gaston went on to, who was in Birmingham, and sometimes my father, we would go over to the Gastons.
Oh, really?
And that it was quite wonderful because Mrs. Gaston was very gracious and would show us her latest buys from Paris or New York, and that they would invite us kids to swim in their swimming pool too, which we liked.
I bet you did. Was that at the hotel or was that at their home?
This was at their home.
Wow.
Yeah, this was at their home.
That's
Yeah.
something. So you said your dad would talk about what was in the papers?
So, but again, it was this kind of, it wasn't so much, they would talk about it, but it was more, again, this kind of matter-of-fact talk of, this has happened, but it wasn't people should, or there was no sign of action or thought of.
Yeah. Was your father or mother registered to vote?
Yes, they both were, and that my father he was also active with the Republican Party,
Okay.
and that most of the people that I knew, they were all Republicans, and that one of the reasons that they were Republicans was because the Democratic Party at that time throughout Alabama was connected to the Dixiecrats, and it was really connected to white citizens councils and some of the most racist groups, and so they then were very much a part of the Republican Party. And that he went to, I want to think that he went, one of his trips that we didn't go on, I want to think that he may have gone to California to a Republican political convention at some point.
I'm trying to think, I know one of the conventions from 1960 was in California, and I can't remember which it was.
Mm-hmm.
One was in California, one was in Chicago
Yeah.
that year. So what awareness did you have of the civil rights movement as it's growing stronger? You're probably, middle school and high school?
And we didn't make the distinctions of calling it middle school. You went elementary through grade 8, and then 9th grade and through 12th was high school. And my first awareness of it was with my first real awareness was the Montgomery bus boycott. So I would have been about 9, I guess, then.
That makes sense.
And that with the bus boycott, there was, I knew who Rosa Parks was. I knew about the demonstrations and the boycotts, and we had some kind of boycotts and some activities in Birmingham. And the people in my world had been a part of that.
Did you know Reverend Shuttlesworth as a kid or ever go to meetings?
I did not know him, and I knew of him. I knew who he was, but I did not.
How far away is Montgomery from your community?
Montgomery was, at that time, it's about, I think about maybe 120 miles or so, and this was pre-freeways, and you had to go through some pretty god-awful towns. There was this one town, Alabaster, and that it was like a speed trap, and so you sort of eased your way slowly through Alabaster, because it had both the speed trap aspect of it, but you also worried then about being stopped by police,
Yeah.
So it was a longer journey than 120 miles needs to be, but
So it doesn't feel as close as it would
no.
today.
But we did go to Montgomery, and we went to Montgomery because each year, maybe once or twice each year, we would go down to my father's, where he had all of those relatives in Bullock County, and there were a couple of times when we spent 2 weeks in the summer on the farm with our relatives down there, which was yet another world.
Did you enjoy the farm?
I did very much so. And again, it was one where my father had introduced me to it in a way of just sort of taking us out there, and there we are, and he sort of says, like, this is our land. As far as you can see and as far as you can walk, this is our land, and that, our folks own this land. And so and he would then take us and show us things, like there was one place where there's a spring that comes out from the ground, and with this mossy spring water, and the water was delicious, but it was this cold, ice cold water that was coming from underground. So, those were marvelous things to us. And that he would show us different plants and things. I remember him disliking it when he showed me a thistle plant and showed me how to, he had me rub it on my hand.
Experiential learning.
Yes, exactly. And it hurt,
It did.
But he'd take us out, and I learned to use a rifle. We are talking about people who hunt, and that in our house we always had, several guns, and so, mostly rifles and things. And so he would take us and start with the tin cans, and then watch out birds and squirrels,
Yeah. Did you like shooting?
I did not really. I liked the tin cans. I liked it, for the sort of practice of it's like a game and a sport, and you're trying to become accurate about it. But to me, there was no joy in killing anything.
Yeah.
Even a rodent to me would not be fun to kill in that way. So I didn't like that, but I did enjoy the lining up the tin cans and shooting them. But
Target practice.
yeah, but then I just became fearful, more concerned about all of the awful things that could happen with guns. And because in our community back in Fairfield, there were a few years where it was popular for kids to get BB guns, these little air rifles, pellet guns, for Christmas gifts. And then there were the awful stories about people losing an eye to a pellet gun. And so,
Seems like every time a BB gun goes off,
yes, it's headed for someone's eye. So
It's like a homing pigeon.
it really. So with those stories, I don't know whether those were suburban legends or what, but it was not of interest to me.
Yeah. What about other elements of the civil rights movement?
But the first was the bus boycott, and so knowing about the bus boycott, that was my first introduction. And then I want to think, but it's a hazy memory that there were some boycotts around stores, some idea of boycotts around stores because of treatment, and it came more into focus though when I was in high school, and that with the freedom rides, and that was very definitely something that we were, glued to radio, TV, watching news, looking at newspapers, and getting word about what was happening, particularly as the freedom riders came towards Birmingham and the treatment that they'd get in where I think it was Anniston and then Birmingham. And so that was all something that was very, very palpable.
Did you go into Birmingham when freedom riders were in Birmingham?
Not in connection with them.
Yeah.
We went into Birmingham almost, we went to downtown Birmingham probably every week. Every week we were, and sometimes multiple times, like as I mentioned, I would go over for my music lessons in the summer. I went swimming there, and since Fairfield had no public swimming pools, I went swimming in Birmingham. And so there were all of these kinds of activities that we were constantly moving back. We had relatives that lived on, one other part of Birmingham, so we were just always moving back and forth through that whole geography was my world. So I didn't think of it as separate. Yeah. And it was an easy kind of movement back and forth. I could bike to the swimming pools. I could bike to some of these places.
Almost like it's
yeah.
the same. Well, it must have, the freedom rides going through Birmingham must have made that seem very real.
Oh, very much so.
In your community.
Right. No, very much so. So the freedom rides were very definitely a big deal. And then also when Martin Luther King and the demonstrations of Martin Luther King in Birmingham jail. And that the call then for students to participate, that was the first time that we then, and I was in high school, and that Professor Oliver, our principal, forbade us to participate and to leave campus. In fact, he sort of, locked the school doors because he didn't want us participating in the demonstrations. And that was just the wrong thing to do with a group of... Yeah, because then, of course, we then left school against his orders and went downtown Birmingham to participate. And that some of my classmates were arrested, and this is now the Kelly Ingram Park
63
demonstrations and things, and some people were arrested, some were, hit by with the fire hoses and everything. I was not. I wasn't in that area when those events took place, but I had left school and was participating in these demonstrations.
Were you arrested?
No, not at that time. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did your parents think?
that by then my mother had passed away, my mother had died, and my father, though, had, at first, he then was upset that we had disobeyed, because I think that the principal called our parents. And, that, so there was for about, we were suspended, I think, from school. And so for a couple of weeks, we were, what we were being castigated for what we had done. And that it wasn't that we were being castigated for participating in the civil rights activities. It was for disobeying our elders. And
is that coming from your father or the principal?
The principal, but with parents, piling on. And that then it became sort of, it turned at some point, and there was a point at which it changed where then we were being hailed as heroes.
Do you think it's when the victory came?
Well,
What do you mean over time?
This was right during that time period. It became okay that we had done this. So by the time I graduated from high school in May of '63, it was okay. This wasn't mentioned because this still was, I think the principal was still smarting from the fact that we had disobeyed him. But that it wasn't, now it was not as though this was an awful thing that we had done.
Yeah.
And so, I think that it gave, doing so gave me greater confidence. I think that I and my classmates, we certainly felt that we did the right thing. And that with my father, we went to a couple of mass meetings, but I don't remember precisely what the meetings were about, but I know that they were connected still to the campaign that King and others, SCLC, had in reference to Birmingham.
Do you remember what it was like to be in the mass meetings? How you felt?
I felt it was a very positive feeling, and the only other time that I had experienced that was when we had gone to that screening that I mentioned at Miles College when I was younger. And it was because it was the people of my community, that we were a community, but we were a community around an issue or a topic, not a community around a funeral, or because that's generally when we would gather in a church or in any place where we're sitting down in a large group, over 50s, and to my sense, this was probably 100 people or more, and crowded churches, and that these were the only times when we were then there for a serious conversation about a topic, and not for a preacher haranguing us about, fire and brimstone and
where you're headed.
Right, exactly.
Speak.
I don't. Not at that point. Later, but I don't remember hearing him speak when I was in high school in Birmingham, but,
When you were in high school, did you have any sense that you would ultimately immerse yourself in the movement and become a full-time?
Not at all. Very definitely not. Not at all. At that point, I really thought that I thought that I would have a career in medicine, and that I was focused more on the sciences, and that I thought that I would probably live in New York and work in New York. Yeah.
You mentioned to me another time that you had internships in the summer in New
Right,
York.
exactly.
Was that one of the influences?
Right.
Can you talk about those?
And that was both, and it's interesting because that was one of the conflicts that I had with my civil rights work. It was these, having at that age to make some really hard choices and tough decisions. And the summer of '63, I was in New York, so I did not participate. I followed the march on Washington in the newspapers and on television, but I was in New York working at Sloan Kettering Memorial Center because I had this internship there.
How did you get that, do you know?
Yes, I know exactly how I got that. My father, as I mentioned, my father was born in 1899. And so my father was an older father in one sense, and that he had had a previous family. He had been married before, and his first wife had died. And in his first marriage, he had two daughters. He had another child, too, who didn't survive him, a young guy who died as a young boy. But he had these daughters, and so I had two sisters. And that my sisters lived in New York City. And my sisters worked at Sloan Kettering. They were lab technicians. My father had seemed to be, in some ways, like the proverbial Jewish mother, where he wanted a doctor in the family. And so he had tried that with them and had not succeeded. But he had gotten to the point that they had become lab technologists. So they were lab technicians, and they worked at Sloan Kettering. And they worked in cancer research. And so when they then learned that there was this internship program, they invited me to apply for it, and I was accepted. And so they said that I could stay with one of them while I went through that. It just happened to be the year, too, that they were both pregnant.
Interesting timing.
And so I ended up also having newborn nephews. And
Wow, that's quite an experience.
Yes.
Did it give you a sense of what you wanted in your immediate future?
Well, I was most impressed. I loved working in New York City.
Yeah.
That the children were not, the children were interesting,
Right.
but I had been around babies in my community. Sadly, even at that point, teenage girls would have their own kids and everything, and I knew that was not something that I wanted.
Not right now.
No.
Yeah.
But that what I did really love, I loved living in New York. And so I stayed in Queens with my sister and would take the train in to Manhattan each day. It worked at Sloan Kettering, and through the people at Sloan Kettering, I met, there was one woman who worked there as well. She was a nurse, and that she was originally, I think, from Sweden. But she became a friend and invited me sometimes to stay over in the city with her and her roommates. And one of her roommates was a flight attendant, and another worked at the UN.
Wow.
And they would invite me to, parties and things. And so this was all quite heady stuff I think I was 16 or 17 years old at the time. So this was absolutely wonderful. And we'd go to plays, and I saw the Flying Dutchman. I saw several other really wonderful plays, and saw experimental theater, as well as my sister leaned towards the Broadway musicals. My older sister did, and so I'd go to those with her, and But that in addition to that, then these friends that I had met liked things that were a lot more intellectually challenging and much more cosmopolitan, and so it was just wonderful.
Sounds like you had a lot more opportunities to see the outside world than your average Southern kid.
Right, exactly. So I was, really enjoying that experience, but I also felt that I should be at the March on Washington. And I would talk with the doctors there about this. I made some really nice friendships for that time, and we'd talk about this. And
were they interested, supportive?
They were supportive. All of them were absolutely supportive, and they even sort of said that if I was interested, that one was at that point a dean at Cornell, and said that if I was interested, he would help me get into Cornell, and that I could then go to Cornell's medical school. And so they were very, very supportive. So I had this wonderful array of friends and there, but that I also then felt, by virtue of what I was reading about and what was happening in the movement, that I should be, in terms of the March on Washington, that's where I should be as well.
Did you try to figure out how to get there? Did you get that far?
No, because I knew it was,
Lost cause?
yeah.
Yeah. Were you interested in being a doctor? Did that appeal to you?
I was very, at that point I was interested. I felt that I was good at science, and particularly at biology, and that I thought that I could be a very competent doctor, a good doctor. But it was also something where the experience that year at Sloan Kettering, that I began to realize too, though, that I didn't want to work with people who were dying. It was that I didn't work directly with patients. Instead, I was doing this lab work and doing the math. This was pre-computers. So we do these lab tests, and that you do the readings, and then I'd spend the last half of the afternoon doing all of these computations, and you were doing those with one of these big calculators and a slide rule.
Wow. Yeah.
And I loved my slide rule.
Did you?
And I was so thrilled that I had mastered the slide rule. But, so you'd do all of these computations, but then there was, and then you'd give the results to the doctors. And that's where you were doing blood and urine analysis. And they would then make decisions about treatment. And then there would be this times when they would say, oh, you don't have to do this person's anymore. You can just discard that. And that meant that the person had died.
That must have been tough.
And so that was something that I felt was like, I don't know, I'm not so sure about, being a doctor then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially not one working in cancer
Yeah.
treatment.
And then the next year I went back to Sloan Kettering the summer of '64. They invited me back. I went back the summer of '64. And this time I thought, well, maybe I should focus more on the research side. And they were doing the experiments with the lab animals, with the dogs, and you'd inject the dye into the dogs and the rats, and tracing tumors and things. And so that was also not exactly something that, it gave you a real sense of how challenging and how difficult this work was, and how we were so clueless about cancer. And there was one doctor who I worked with, I don't remember his name, and that he was so highly respected because he had done some kind of isolation of something that was considered quite important. And then I remember thinking, oh, this is so wonderful, I'm getting to work with him. And one day I just sort of casually asked him, so how long have you been doing this? And he said, 20 years. And for me, at my age, to think that 20 years and that all that he has done is to isolate this one little thing that in terms of a cure or a treatment of cancer means very little. Just, it seemed as though you were trying to, sort of eat the moon or something. So it was like,
So those hands-on experiences were very educational.
They were very educational, very, very good, and very productive for me. But that was the point at which then and that was the summer of '64, where again now I felt that I really should be in the South. And here I was reading about Goodman, Cheney and Schwerner. Yeah, I was reading about Freedom Summer, in the pages of the New York Times. And
were you in college by this time?
I was at Tuskegee. I was in Tuskegee.
So would this have been the summer after your freshman year, probably?
Right.
Okay.
And at Tuskegee, I had the first year that right after I arrived there, I started meeting students. There was, you end up with the usual group where they're trying to get you to become part of a sorority. And I realized I had absolutely no interest in that whatsoever. And there was a group of students who were talking about some demonstrations about desegregating the little downtown area of Tuskegee. And so that appealed to me much, much more. That was something that I was far more interested in. So I then attended some of the student meetings around that. And then I also met this woman, Mrs. Lomax, who's Michael Lomax, the later became the head of Fulton County, and now I think he's with the United Negro College Fund. His mother, at that time, ran a had a newspaper in Tuskegee, and she and this other man, Dr. Gomillion, and Gomillion was interested in voter rights, and for some reason, I don't know why I went to meet with him. I was really curious about what he was doing, but I became very interested. His focus was gerrymandering and about how they had taken Macon County and done all of his work. The whites had just broken the county up in ways so that blacks would never be able to have a majority and get a vote. And for some reason that intrigued me and was of real interest to me. And it didn't have anything to do with my schoolwork. And so but I went over and met with him, and through a combination of those meetings and meeting other people, I became much more interested in working on some of the civil rights issues there at Tuskegee.
I know that he was involved in a Supreme Court case related to voting in Macon County. Do you remember whether that had been heard before or after you met him? Was it?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
It goes back to the 50s, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Hit the court.
The work that he was doing was something that he had been doing for quite some time.
Yeah.
To financially, at one point, I don't remember whether it was that, because I was able to go to college only because I had a full scholarship. My father had sort of said, you want to go to college? That's great.
Go ahead.
You're right, go right ahead.
Did your older brother go?
My older brother did. My older brother went to to Tennessee State for a while, and then for a year, and then he transferred to Tuskegee.
So he followed you?
He did indeed. So we were both at Tuskegee, and that when I think he actually ended up at Tuskegee before I did, though.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he didn't follow me. I think he was at Tuskegee before me, and that I then, when I was at Tuskegee, that I then really was not getting. Maybe I'd get $10 every quarter, from my dad or something, but
Very generous allotment.
not much at all. So that I needed to work, and at one point, the job that I had gotten myself a job working in the hospital based on my experience with Sloan Kettering. I had gotten a job working at the hospital there at Tuskegee, and I quit that when they wanted me to draw blood. And I felt that I was inexperienced, and actually I was comfortable with working in the laboratory, and that they kept just sort of saying, "Oh, you just go and do it," and I just thought, no, you don't practice on people, and they kept really pushing me, and so the one point where I sort of was, okay, I'm going to go and do this, and it was a young woman who was in labor, and then I felt, no way in the world I am going to go and play, and practice with this poor woman who is in so much pain. And so I just said, I quit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I assume that was a black hospital?
Yes.
Working in New York, did you consider trying to go to college in New York?
I didn't at that time because I had this scholarship. I had gotten a scholarship by participating in a science fair. It was a statewide science fair, and that I won this. It was the Gorgas sort of scholarship or something, the Gorgas something scholarship, and that it was full tuition and room and board to for 4 years to a black college in Alabama. So it was a segregated prize.
Is that to buy off people who might desegregate the schools?
But it was a prize nonetheless, but it was a
Yeah.
black prize. I think that there was a white equivalent
Yeah.
that went to then the University of Alabama or Auburn or something, but then this was to the black schools.
What? Oh, I was gonna say, what was your project?
My project was one where I did a demonstration of sound waves, of showing the how the frequency of sound waves could be graphically represented by, I created this thing that would kind of like bobble in water, vibrate in water. It had like a pool of water as a part of it, and I made this little thing that would sort of touch down on it like a needle point, but with something like a little cork or something. And that then if the frequency was higher, it had a different wavelength that from the base waves that, and so I did all of the, appropriate paperwork to support this. And
Sounds like an interesting project.
so, and then, you had the little rheostat thing where you could rev it up. I mean, this was pre-Radio Shack. They had this, it was called Tandy, I think. And that there was the Tandy Corporation. And they sold all of these kind of hobby things that went the gamut from the kind of stuff that you could find now in a Radio Shack to these little hobby kinds of kits where you could get a piece of little leather and stamp it with designs and burnish it. And yeah, so that was my kind of place. I'm still gadget oriented, and so it was my kind of place. So I could go there and pick up enough things to sort of assemble this and put this project together.
I wondered if it was sort of influenced by or shared interests, like your dad's ability to take things apart and put them together to construct something like
right,
that.
exactly. Well, we had been very much encouraged along that mode
To develop that interest.
to develop those kinds of interests, or to feel that if you had an interest like that you should just do it.
Yeah.
And the same was true of, it ranged from architecture, so that at one point he was going to expand the house, and he asked that we would submit designs for the expansion.
Well, that's great.
We all did, and that we proposed that we should have this playroom, and that we should have, my room would be on one side, their room would be on the other side, the boys, and that we would be separated by this larger playroom that would have an elevated platform for our electric trains. And
How did that go?
it went quite well. The one thing that he did that he shouldn't have done, he shouldn't have followed our advice about the skylights. We thought it would be great to have skylights in this playroom, and the heat that came through those things in summer, uninsulated glass, I mean, it's a wonder it didn't set the place on fire. It was,
Alabama.
yeah.
So did the three of you develop it together?
First we were working separately, and then we had each our separate designs, and then after he sort of picked aspects from each design and everything, that then we became more of a team and worked together.
That must have been pretty exciting.
It was.
That kind of impact. I mean, that's real efficacy.
And that he had, and I had the vision that it would have the room for the trains would have the scenery all around the walls, and that it would have the sky. So it was like my little Sistine Chapel bit to paint all of the stars and clouds and things, and then
Did that? Wow.
and then the trees, along the walls and everything. So it was quite an undertaking, but
Sounds like it. I don't know many parents who have their kids give their kids the space for that.
yeah, or say, fine, go draw on the walls, yeah.
No, that's not a lot.
And that he would, then I, move from that to wanting canvas, and so he would buy me canvas and paints, and so I started doing oil paintings, and I would draw, and there was one time that I wanted a friend of mine had a Monopoly game. And I just thought it was so much fun, and I wanted a Monopoly set. And he refused to buy me one. He said, absolutely not. And so one weekend, I borrowed my friend's Monopoly set, and I copied it. I got cardboard, and I copied her. I wish that I had it now.
Oh, that would be...
Because it would be, folk art now. But I copied her Monopoly set down to making the box to put the board in. And the only thing that I didn't make as original things were the little pieces. How you'd have I made the little houses, but then there were the little tokens that you could have as that represented you. Right, exactly. Yeah, and I've forgotten where I got those, but I got some little toys or something to, serve for those. But
did you like playing Monopoly as well on your board, your set?
I did, very much so, with my own money that I had made. But I took the time to do the whole thing,
Yeah.
So.
It sounds like you had a lot of creativity and independence in your childhood.
So, and that later, that became a real asset. Those were things that became, real strengths for me later. So going back to Tuskegee and and now my having to sort of make a living for myself. One point I had worked in the hospital, and then another point I worked for this photo studio. And I went there. I was doing these colored tints. There was a point where instead of color photographs, they were black and white photos, and that you then applied, like little rosiness to the cheeks, lipstick.
Wow.
But you touched
on black and white photos.
On black and white photos.
It's almost like are you photoshopping?
Yeah, it was. It really was.
Yeah.
And so I then was doing that for this photographer. And that later, years later, long after I had left Tuskegee, I discovered that was like a famous photography studio. This was one of these, like there's James Vanderzee.
Yeah.
Well, this guy, I think it's Polk, was another one of these, great photographers and someone who documented the African American community in these striking ways. So that was yet another place that I had worked. But through this work, sometimes I ended up meeting people who were beyond just the classroom. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have an experience of Tuskegee with just, I'm getting up and I'm going to class and I'll be back in my dorm room.
You're connected to the community.
But I ended up then meeting people that took me beyond that. And I was put into an honors program where I didn't have to go to conventional classes. That I had one, like I took calculus with just meeting with the professor. And I was allowed to pick classes that were not limited to the undergraduate program. So I had friends. I took classes in the School of Veterinary Medicine, because I really enjoyed biology and everything. And so I took a course in animal parasitology, I remember.
Is that parasites?
Yeah, it was disgusting.
I bet it was.
How many worms can inhabit the stomach of But so I took some of those courses, and I took another one on, it was poisonous plants. But through the School of Veterinary Medicine, I was taking these sort of more advanced classes. Mm-hmm. And that then led me to mingle with a group of people who were, in some cases, actual professors as opposed to students. So through them, I met people there was a woman, Doris Mitchell, who was a resident of Tuskegee and who came from I think her father may have been a doctor. She herself was a veterinarian, and that she and Odetta were friends. And so, and that she, and that she had a Daimler. She had a little sports car that she had imported from Germany. She had a Daimler that she sort of tool around in
Macon County?
in Macon County.
Wow.
In this house that was just incredible. So I was being exposed to this people who, and it was both intellectual exposure, just in cultural, but also then it meant that you were talking, much more seriously about ideas, and that of course, ideas at that time meant that you were talking about race and racism as well, and the problems of segregation and the lack of opportunity for people of color.
So what are some of the civil rights things that you're doing while you're at Tuskegee, while you're also working and expanding your network?
So I started working on going out into the rural Macon County with registering people to vote. And I don't remember whether that was at the behest of, the Gomillion group or some, I don't know quite how that started, but that was one of the things that I started doing. And then I met Gwen Patton and George Ware. George was he was a graduate student in chemistry, I believe, at Tuskegee at the time. And so I met these other students who had similar interests, and I began to work with them. And
was the student group at Tuskegee focused entirely on civil rights in the community, or were they dealing with campus issues?
both. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was the group like? What do you remember about the group?
We spent a lot of it. We were, at first, I think we were a very cohesive, productive group. And then we later became divided. And the division came not out of really an intellectual or strategic divide. It became much more the question. It became Winky, Bill Hall, came to Tuskegee as a representative of SNCC, and that it became much more a question of, wait, this is our group, don't you tell us what to do. And that became the kind of dividing line. And because we were now beginning to have demonstrations and participate, I can't recall what the key issues were then, but I know we were doing some
On campus.
The issues were not on campus. We were doing work like the work was much more desegregating Macon County in the sort of downtown Tuskegee, and issues then about voting rights there. And that had sort of brought us to the attention of SNCC. And so people like Willie Ricks and Bill Hall, Cleve Sellers, people started coming through, SNCC people started coming through, and that then led to this kind of tension with our group of feeling that, well, SNCC can do whatever it wants over there, but that we will be doing these things here. This is our group, and this is what we will be doing. And that there was a point at which I felt that it was, that was counterproductive, and that what we were talking about was a bit too parochial, too, and that I started leaning towards SNCC because I felt that they were engaging the larger issues. That it was that they had the dialogue was much more about what was happening in the country as a whole, and it was a strategy. Then they were much more strategic in thinking that, well, if we can, this is a black belt county, if we can do this with these black belt counties, plural, that then we might be able to create some change rather than let's, march through downtown Tuskegee. And
do you think your broader exposure made you receptive to SNCC's analysis, or to being, to choosing the broader analysis over the more focused?
I'm not sure, because with some of this was the exposure beforehand, in the sense I think I was predisposed towards civil rights activity from having grown up in Birmingham, having participated in the demonstrations when I was in high school, Birmingham then being the place where the church had been bombed.
Yeah, I guess you would have been a freshman
Yeah, I was in college then.
Yeah.
And that my brother, though, knew the family, that one of the girls, from one of the girls. And so it was this, so I think I felt this connection to those things. And I also used to read a lot. And that some of the readings also, and as I had grown up in this circumstance that was very much a union town too, with people who were coal miners and steel workers, and talked about John L. Lewis and, and the importance of the unions. And so I think I had that kind of sense of that if we are organized, that organization and being organized, you can have a voice, that you won't be alone, and that your voice can make a difference. So that was something that I think had been there as a small seed that was now beginning to grow, and that by the time I was in Tuskegee again in 64, then right after I had come back from New York, they were asking for volunteers. They wanted more student volunteers to go to Mississippi to work on the November elections.
Okay.
And this was the November 64 elections. They were trying to get people to come to Jackson, Mississippi, and to other parts to help register people.
And you had just missed Freedom Summer?
And I had just missed Freedom Summer, and so I said yes. And for me, that was one of the times in my life that I felt that I was making a conscious decision about doing something, and I was doing it alone, and that was fine with me. It wasn't like, oh, you're my best friend, will you go with me? We could go. It was that, no, this is something that I feel is important to do, and that I will go.
And you didn't need other people's approval?
And I didn't need other people's
company?
approval, validation. I didn't need parental validation, approval. I could say, yes, I will go, and I went.
What was that experience like?
It was, I went and I stayed, I want to think that I stayed at the place where with Uvester Simpson. I think that she, but I went there, and that, they had us come to a meeting, and after we got off the bus, and they said, here's where you'll stay, and I said, fine. And then they asked, they said, we're going to meet, so we'll be gathering here. And then they told us that what they wanted us to do was to go do this door-to-door canvassing in this particular part of Jackson, and that's what I did.
Yeah.
And I felt, and I was really comfortable with that. The part that was uncomfortable for me, oddly enough, was the social side of it.
Really?
Because I was a shy introvert, and so I'm fine when I'm working, but then when people are socializing, and I wasn't accustomed to the sort of, I remember saying to someone, your husband says that, and she just laughed, this girl just laughed, because, I made the automatic assumption since they were kissing on each other and everything.
That was her husband?
But it was, and she just thought that was so funny, that I would assume that, and I realized that.
Because they was kissing.
Yeah, and that it's something where this was a time where people were a lot more liberal with And so that's where I was not there with them on the social side of
Even
these
though you
things.
had been doing these New York parties.
Right. But these New York parties were much more Mad Men style. I mean, they were tame by comparison to.
Yeah. So going to Mississippi for voter registration was a whole different experience.
Yes, so it was a eye-opening experience in that way, but that I was very comfortable with the work side of it. But it was like, oh, I don't know, these people were, So, with one of the guys like, flirting with me or something, that was a little off-putting and a little scary to me, but because I was, sort of so green and everything.
18,
But
19 years
yeah.
old and not ready for for that. And so then, so if that's the November '64 election, it's after Freedom Summer, but it's before the Voting Rights Act.
Right,
So
right.
are you still having trouble getting people to be successful at registering to vote? Do you have a sense of whether they're accomplishing this?
I didn't, because I just felt that I was like a little soldier in the
bigger unit?
in the bigger unit, and so now I didn't feel that I was privy to nor understood the larger strategy and how successful people were at that, but that I just felt that then this was something that I could do. I could talk to people, and that I felt very good about it. I was really proud of myself for having gone, because people were talking about, oh my God, Mississippi, oh, it's too dangerous, and I would never go to Mississippi. And that I just, it's like Mississippi, Alabama, it's
And
right.
say people in Mississippi say that about Alabama.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Here I am in Tuskegee, I'm in the middle of Alabama, and that I'm going to think that it's more dangerous to go across the border to, the state line to Mississippi.
Yeah.
And that, of course, this was after, Freedom Summer and after Goodman, Schwerney, and Cheney. So it was
Does that exacerbate the concern?
that it very definitely before. So, but I didn't feel that made it a given that something would happen to me or that my life was in mortal danger or anything. So, but I could understand how people from the North or, somewhere, a student from Chicago or something might be quite reluctant to do so.
Were you still in school for the Selma to Montgomery March?
I was.
I guess I just made a big leap from, I guess it's November '64, that organizing started in early '65. So that would have been the same school year then.
And I was in school, and that I left. I'll have to look and see when I left school. I worked with SNCC. I started working very definitely with SNCC. I moved away from the campus group. I still worked with them occasionally, but I moved much further away from the campus group and started working with SNCC. And at first in Wilcox County, and this was down around Gee's Bend. And then I worked, and so at that point, there was a point at which I left school, and I want to think that I left school in probably in the spring of 1966. I know I was still in school when my classmate, Sammy Young, was killed. And Sammy was a part of the student group there. And so we, as a student group, were participating in the Selma to Montgomery activities from Tuskegee. I know that we were coming from Tuskegee. I was not yet working and living in Lowndes County. Later, I actually worked and lived in the Freedom House in Lowndes, but that was later. But at this point, that I was still in Tuskegee, and Gwen Patton, George Ware, Sammy Young, George Parris, Wendy Parrish, that a group of us were working, C.J. Jones, there was a whole group of us who were Tuskegee students, and that we would, though, go to work with SNCC in Lowndes County and go over to Selma. And that's when I met Phyllis Cunningham, who was there with the medical group.
So when you initially are working with SNCC, you're still in classes and you're going back and forth
Right.
from Tuskegee to Selma to Wilcox to
Right.
Lowndes.
Right, and there at a certain
You're
point
part of a
that,
group.
yeah, and at a certain point that became unrealistic and untenable, and that I decided that I would leave school. It was, I felt that I had to make a decision.
Was that a hard choice to make?
It was a very difficult decision for me because I felt that, I had worked out one way of having my college education paid for. And
The scholarship.
right. And now if I said goodbye to that and worked full-time in SNCC, that I had no means of support.
And what would you do to
Yeah.
return to college?
What would I do to return to college? What would I do even for just to
Pay the rent?
yeah, to live, that when students were going to go home for a summer or something at the end of a school year, where would I be going?
Yeah.
You know.
So you didn't think you could or would want to go home to your father's?
I didn't want to. I could, but I wouldn't want to.
You
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
sort of past that of living at home.
Yes, and because my father, he was an eccentric tinkerer, and that as the years were going by, he was becoming even more so.
Yeah.
And sadly, I think he was beginning to show some signs of a dementia, but that it was not something that I did not, and for me, I didn't want to return to Fairfield to live. That was, to me, something that I just knew that I would never want to live there in my life,
Can you articulate why it was that you felt you had to make the choice or that you wanted to make the choice to work full-time in the movement despite what it could mean in terms of your future?
I felt that I was becoming, my time was too divided between the two. I was torn between these activities. That on one hand, I had a professor who was then sort of saying, don't forget, we're to meet at a certain point. And as I said, that they had been quite liberal with me in terms of the approach that was being taken about my classes and everything. So it wasn't as though I had to show up to 20 classes or anything. But still, I did need to write papers and to do certain things in order to succeed academically. And that at the same time, though, then there was we need to have a meeting, this is taking place, we need, to go and talk to canvass this area to get the people to come to this meeting. So where do you stand? What do you do? And that's when I thought long and hard about it. And I became it was a hard decision. I remember becoming quite depressed at one point about, what do I do?
Yeah.
And I didn't have anybody that I really could talk to about this. That my brother, who was at Tuskegee, he and I are very close, but that he was sort of a good guy, more sort of social party animal. He had his sports car, and he was, supportive of the movement, but
Also,
he had definitely created a good work-life balance for himself, which involved parties and girls and things and sports cars, and so I just felt that I had to just think this through and make this decision. And that's when I decided that I would leave school and work with SNCC. And then I convinced myself that I could return,
and you would find a way.
that I would be able to at some point, that if later then I wanted to go and study medicine, I would be able to do so. But that for now.
Did you know that SNCC had, or at least was trying to have, the work-study program? In Mississippi, some of the SNCC folks would work for a while and then go back to school for a while. And SNCC
No, I
would support
didn't.
that effort.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
I think it was one of Ella Baker's,
Uh-huh.
not
Yeah.
surprisingly, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The student group, which was Gwen Patton, George Ware, and a number of us, were working both on the campus, but our student group met on campus, but the real focus of our work was the Macon County area, downtown Tuskegee, such as that is, just a little, and that then we also, though, started working on with SNCC and the other civil rights group on the Selma to Montgomery march.
Okay.
And that was when we students became really part of a group that was going to not start so much in Selma, but go and demonstrate in Montgomery.
Do you know what the thinking was behind going to Montgomery rather than Selma?
I don't recall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When, I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but the work that you were doing with Tuskegee students in the county or in the community,
Mm-hmm.
when you start working more with SNCC, not so much in Montgomery, but in the rural counties, is that more or less the same kind of work, or is there a distinction, a difference in that work?
For me, the distinction was that it was strategically more around the vote.
Okay.
And around registering African Americans to vote and trying to gain pluralities of voters in those black belt counties. And so Macon, Wilcox, Lowndes, those counties in Alabama had significant black populations, and that we were then trying to get as many registered voters in each of them.
At that point, were you thinking about the role of independent politics, or were you thinking more directly just in terms of the vote and not necessarily what happens next?
We're thinking more of we were thinking that if we could register people and that if you could get a plurality in that particular county, that you could, in effect, have black people in charge of the county government and that you could change the dynamic of life in the county by having then the sort of authority of county government.
Were you aware of, I mean, I know you said you followed Freedom Summer. Did you have an understanding of how SNCC thought the challenge had gone in Atlantic City? I mean, I know the people who went through that, many of them were disappointed by that.
Very much so, yes.
And also learning from it.
Right.
So was that something that was communicated to you or that you were aware of?
I was aware of it in a general way. I mean, it wasn't as though people didn't mull over it, talk about it, ad infinitum, but there was the notion that that was an approach that had worked only up to a certain point, and that it had failed in one sense, but that now what we could do is begin to deal with these black belt counties, and particularly Lowndes, and that if we could then gain and really transform the government of one of these counties, that would be a path to a different kind of victory and a different kind of politics.
I don't know if you would remember or if you would have been aware of this. It's been a long time, so I don't remember the specifics, but I had a sense that although Mr. Gamillion was or Dr. Gamillion was a path breaker in many ways, pursuing the franchise and challenging the gerrymandering, that once the Voting Rights Act passed, or once he won some of those court cases, that some people thought he was a little conservative in applying that. That he wanted to be careful not to, threaten whites too much with this black majority. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that. Yeah.
And so I think that there would have been a difference between the Macon dynamic with that and the Lowndes dynamic. So I wondered if you or tapped into that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's something where now, in hindsight, so many years later, I'd have to go. I'm curious about what we were attempting to do as a whole in Wilcox County, for example, and why we felt that, oh, let's not put too much effort there. There.
Why Lowndes got the bulk of the attention?
I feel that I understand why Lowndes got the bulk of the attention, but we had enough people and enough interest to have maintained activity in Wilcox as well. But I feel that there was somehow strategically that we didn't quite, there was felt that it wasn't necessary, or that it wasn't possible to have the same kind of win. And Wilcox was an interesting place in and of itself. It had a completely different dynamic there because of the kind of isolation of Gee's Bend.
Okay. Was it, my sense is it had the same kind of black supermajority.
It had the black supermajority, but that the whites had they had sort of cut the bridge, so that Gee's Bend was this little world unto itself.
And it was so difficult for them to connect
To
the
even
rest
go,
of the county.
right, exactly.
Are there any sizable towns in Wilcox or Greene?
There are, but I can't even remember the names of them. Yeah. And particularly in Wilcox, we didn't go to the principal town because that was the one that was sort of cut off in a sense. Yeah.
So is Gee's Bend a town? I always think of it more as just rural.
It's more rural, but it's an enclave. I mean, now we would, something having that same dynamic we'd call a subdivision.
Yeah.
But in those days it was, and you probably know all of the history of it and how coming out of the New Deal, it was one of those kind of
farm security.
Yeah, and it had
Bought land.
where they had also a community center, and then people had these houses all sort of. It was a planned community in that way.
Was that one? Was it funded through the Farm Security Administration?
I don't know.
Farmers are buying land.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
And that all of the people were named Petaway.
Black and white.
All the blacks.
Yeah.
They came from the Petaway plantation, and they were all named Petaway. So everybody was a Petaway. Yeah. But so it was an unusual place, and culturally, and it's a kind of isolated place. But going back to Go Million, I remember him as being one of the players and a force there, but I don't remember doing things actively in Macon.
There's a Reaping the Whirlwind, I think. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a book about Tuskegee, or the community, the school.
Uh-huh.
I want to continue with Lowndes, but before, I don't want to forget Montgomery. So can you talk about what the Montgomery, you said that Tuskegee students were going to Montgomery during the Selma to Montgomery March and doing demonstrations there. Can you describe your involvement in that and what it was like?
I recall there, and now Jim Foreman, in addition to other SNCC people, Jim Foreman was also a presence at Tuskegee. And that Jim and some other SNCC workers then were asking that we would then go to Montgomery, and that I recall that we then had picket signs. I don't remember what the signs said, but that we then went to march in front of the state capitol in Montgomery, and this is what used to be the White House of the Confederacy, where Jeff Davis has a star or something, and so we were going to demonstrate there, and that students would go and would march there, and then go back to campus, and we then went, and the day that we went, there was a counter demonstration. I think there were maybe about, I want to think maybe about 40, 50 of us and that we were marching in this oval loop there in front of the state capitol. The capitol itself, behind us, there was the state troopers with their billy clubs, and they would slap them against their thighs for dramatic effect every now and then. So they were standing there in a big line, so you knew that you couldn't go further that way. And there was a point at which it was the Klan or a group. The people said it was the Klan, but they were not robed. But they were these men and women, white men and women, that then in these cars that came up and were coming up. You could see them come up the street there, and they were coming up, and a few cars came up, and they of course yelled the usual nigger and and a few other things, and there was like a big parade though of them coming, and the troopers started saying that Klan was coming, and that they were talking among each other, and that we meanwhile are still marching like this. And then there was at one point at which one of the officers said, arrest them all. And it was almost, on one hand, and we had been instructed, we had all gone through the training where if you're being arrested, you go limp, and you're sort of carried and thrown into the paddy wagon or the van or whatever. And so we were arrested, and that's what we went through, our usual going limp, and were taken away. And we were arrested just before that group came fully up the hill. So there was, on one hand, a sense of relief because you didn't quite know if you're between
the highway patrol and the Klan.
Right, and the highway patrol with their billy clubs, and then if you're with this, sort of vigilante kind of group there, it doesn't seem like a safe place to be.
No, not exactly.
Yeah. And that it wasn't as though we, I think, were thinking of it. I know I later talked with one of my classmates who was there, and that we were thinking that there was no place for us to go.
Right.
That, if they had not arrested us, that we would probably have sat down there.
Mm-hmm.
And just
between the two.
Right.
So what happened when you were arrested?
So we were arrested, and we were taken to this place, to this jail, which was a Montgomery County jail. And we were, I think I was there for about like 5 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it like to be in jail?
It was, on one hand, it was something where I wasn't afraid. I was not afraid at all. And I wasn't afraid because there were so many of us, because we were together and we were singing freedom songs. And so the camaraderie and everything at the beginning was very good. As time went on, it became harder, and it became harder because of the conditions there. The bathrooms were overflowing, so it was absolutely smelly, filthy, horrid. The food was, just terrible and inedible, practically. So, somebody sort of said, let's go on a hunger strike, and you felt that's easy enough to do, because the food was so absolutely so awful. But I wasn't at any point fearful. I wasn't, fearful for my life, and that more people were being arrested too. Mm-hmm. And so the numbers were growing, and it was a more diverse group that was being arrested. There were some whites from New York and other places who now were, being brought in, and so you were meeting these people. So it was like a giant gathering of people, of women, and there were some local women who were a little befuddled. The people who had been arrested for other things. I never asked or found out what they had been arrested for, but they found us curiosities.
I bet they did.
Yeah. And we'd all, sort of mingle and talk, and
yeah. did you get out? Did somebody bail you out?
Someone
Or did
bailed
they
us
decide
out,
they
yeah.
didn't want to keep
Yeah.
you any longer?
Someone bailed us out.
Did you have to go back and go to court?
We did not. We did not. That I want to think that William Kunstler had arranged for us to be released, and I want to think that they filed some things where later all of the charges were dismissed.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we were arrested. I think the charge was that we were arrested for resisting arrest. So.
That's always a curious point.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
you're resisting arrest with no other charge.
Right. Exactly. So I think that.
They didn't, it wasn't probably too
Right.
challenging to get it tossed out once, yeah.
But I think that Kunstler, because I think Kunstler played a role then in our being released.
I know that a lot of people say that he played an important role in coming up with some of the more creative strategies
Right.
of forcing the issue and like that.
And on a subsequent arrest in Atlanta with Karen Spellman, Faye Bellamy, and Ruby Doris Robinson, one during the holiday season in December in Atlanta, when I was working in the Atlanta office, we were arrested. And then I think Howard Moore,
Who was,
Julian Bond's brother-in-law, then he
was the person.
was the person who,
I knew that he did a lot of movement
yeah,
work. So you, Ruby Doris, Karen Spellman, and
Faye Bellamy. Mm-hmm.
What were you all arrested for?
We had been working at the SNCC office all day, and it was in the midst of the Christmas holidays, and that we'd been working, and we'd closed the office. The office was now closed, and we thought, let's do something that would just be relaxing and fun.
And you said, let's get arrested.
And we thought, no, let's go to Auburn Avenue. Let's go down to the main black street at that time in Atlanta, Auburn Avenue, and hear some music, and have dinner and hear some music. And that we were walking there, and we had afros. So we were rather distinctive, identifiable. And so we were walking along, and that Faye was very tall and gazelle-like and very striking. And so the group of us are all walking, just us women walking down. And these black policemen then slowed down to a crawl, and then they are driving alongside us. At the same, we're walking, and they now are driving along at the same pace that we're walking. And Faye then finally says, "And what are you looking at? And what do you want?" And that she used an expletive along with that. And they pulled over and arrested us. So here we were, and of course, then we were saying, how can we be, what have we done?
Yeah.
And
How did you feel about that?
well, became yet another interesting evening, but it was that, what was it, that later we found that I think two of the policemen were like Vietnam vets.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But it was this whole thing of what is this about and why? And it was this kind of, you felt that you were being harassed because we were obviously movement people, and that was, our hair was the giveaway.
Yeah.
And that that the police would then just feel that, oh no, somehow they were going to show us who was the authority here.
What about the fact that they're black officers?
Oh, that's what I feel that it was more about. I feel that it was about them sort of feeling that, oh no, we'll show you who's the authority here.
It's a way that they can exercise their
Right,
authority.
exactly.
They're probably not doing that in the white community.
Right.
I mean, I think you probably experienced this, but it seems like black police were explicitly intended to control the black community when they were first brought in.
Well, I think that there was a kind of and in different places, I think black police have played, different roles, varying roles. But I think in this particular circumstance, that this was a time when I believe that they felt that the civil rights and that the movement and, this is like black power and all of those kind of frightening things for them that challenge their authority and lead to, could lead to riots and all kinds of problems. And I think that they just felt that, this was an easy chance to just show these people in the civil rights movement,
So your very presence is a threat?
Yeah.
So is this, you said it's Christmas, it's era of Black Power, is this probably like December 66, December 67?
I think it's probably like 67.
Okay.
I'll have to try to find Karen, that, I can get some validation for some of these things from her. Sadly, the numbers of people who are still alive and can do that have dwindled. Yeah.
So can you tell us what it was like to be organizing in Lowndes County? Were you living in Lowndes County at
I
that
was
point?
living in Lowndes County, and I had been living in Wilcox County and would come over for meetings with Stokely, Carmichael, Ralph Featherstone, Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Ivanhoe. We would meet there from time to time, and some of them would be coming from Atlanta, and we would all then have these meetings. But then when I was asked to actually come and work in Lowndes County, then I moved into the Freedom House. So the building, there are photographs of the shack, which had been, I think, belonged to the Jackson family. So that shack of a house was our office by day, but it was also then where we actually stayed. And that we had sleeping bags, and so we'd sleep in our sleeping bags. And the building was, you could see the stars by looking up, and you could see the ground by looking down.
It's just like camping.
Yeah. And we had had one of those little pot-belly stoves, wood stoves that you use that to keep warm. And so those conversations around the fire meant that you turned one way, and after that part of your body started getting toasty, you then turn another way. So these conversations had this sort of natural rhythm of movement to them.
That's crazy.
But it was really interesting that was a very special time for me. I was very pleased that I was considered one of the key workers there, and that it was not that I was being treated like, oh, you're a girl, you're a woman, but it was that in the evening when we'd get together and we'd be sitting around that, the little stove, or we'd be talking, that we were talking about what had happened during the day in terms of our work in the county, but it was a wonderful time where we were also talking broader strategies and about the world. And some of us were reading Frantz Fanon and reading his books and Black Skins, White Mask, and we would talk about what does freedom mean? What does revolution mean? What does change mean? What does it mean to have power? What's happening in the world? And what is it that we would want for our people? Ralph Featherstone, for example, felt that economic empowerment was absolutely essential. And he thought that we should eventually work on projects that would bring greater economic empowerment to people. And that's something that he, before his death, had worked on some projects that were around the economics.
He was a teacher too, right? Before he was in SNCC?
Yes, yes.
What were some of the economic ideas that he had or projects he worked on?
Well, they in some parts of Mississippi, they started doing catfish farming, where
Okay.
where you could, where people could then raise catfish and sell those commercially. Yeah.
I mean, I heard of that in the Delta, but I didn't realize that SNCC was involved with it.
Well, SNCC per se wasn't, but
he was working independently.
right. He later, as time moved on, he began, and that he then, for example, Ed Brown, Rap Brown's brother, was another person who was interested in the economic empowerment ideas, and so he eventually became the head of that group, Mississippi Action for Community Education, MACE, in Mississippi. And so Ed and Charles Bannerman and a few others then worked on setting up
Okay, those catfish farms.
those kinds of activities. They had one, Fine Vines, I think it was called, it was a blue jeans, where people were doing, they were doing textile work and then also doing piece work for sewing jeans, like garment work. So that they were doing those kinds of things. And I worked with them. I worked for